And so, continuing with Sloterdijk's, with the discussion of Sloterdijk's rules for the human zoo, he comes to the section in which he quotes from Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and he says that Zarathustra is walking, and he saw a row of houses, and the houses made him depressed because he realized that they were tantamount to the making of the wild man, the last man. And of course, the last man for Nietzsche is the man at the end of history, basically the consumer, Fukuyama's consumer at the end of history, who, because he has had all of his needs met, no longer has any dreams of any great achievements anymore. And so this is the dwarfing principle, what Nietzsche called the dwarfing principle. Precisely the image of taming and domesticating the human being was for Nietzsche a questionable thing, because when you tame and domesticate, what you do is you transform wolves into dogs, or let's say you breed a wild ram and you get rid of its horns, and the horns are gone. So its dangerous element, it's been depotentiated of its dangerous element, just as the wolf is depotentiated into its dangerous element and becoming domesticated, becomes the dog. The same thing happens with the human being. It's a question of a process. The domestication of the human being is tantamount also to a dwarfing principle. That in him which is great is made small, and he becomes merely harmless, defanged, domesticated, tamed, manipulable, and becomes basically part of a herd, in which the shepherd is, of course, those who are in charge in whatever the state is that happens to be lording over them. Of course, this idea of the shepherd is an idea that goes all the way back to the dawn of civilization, to the Sumerians, where the oldest idea, where you have Dumuzi, the idea is the king. The king is Dumuzi. He is the great shepherd of his people. This goes all the way back to the Sumerians. It's a very old idea, but it's an interesting idea. It's a complex idea because it makes a comparison between human beings in a state of civilization with domesticated animals, and therefore depotentiated animals, which are dangerous no longer and therefore can be manipulated by a power elite. And so Sloterdijk is beginning to raise questions here now as we track this evolution of the clearing and this evolution of the process of different metaphors that have been involved in the domestication of the human being. Who is doing the domesticating nowadays begins to become the issue here. For Nietzsche, the issue was, of course, humanists versus superhumanists. For him, the Übermensch would be something that would come far in the future. The Nazis, according to Sloterdijk, made the mistake of thinking that it referred to them. But this was a process, the superhuman, the one who is in command of himself, not somebody who is led as part of a flock, but the one who leads the flocks, was for Nietzsche something that would take millennia to develop, a long, long time. And but this opposition between humanism and superhumanism leads to the issue of a second darker horizon. Behind the clearing in its domesticating sense is this darker horizon about possible issues of eugenics, possible issues of breeding human beings in such a way that they are depotentiated. But who's in control of this becomes the issue for Sloterdijk. Who is in control of this? The human zoo, then, is contemporary civilization. It is civilization. He says that, and he refers to Plato in this, and Plato's discussion in The Statesman about the difference between the leader and the led is that the human being is the self-fencing animal who always domesticates himself. But the issue now is the zoo is the human being in a state of civilization in which now we have sports stadiums and arenas as the exhibits for the human animal. And so notice that in using the metaphor of the zoo, that Sloterdijk has changed the ontological status of the human being from a tamed animal back to an animal. We had Heidegger's, earlier in the essay, we had Heidegger's idea that the human being isn't an animal at all, but now we have Sloterdijk saying, well, he is basically an animal who is put into a human theme park. And the issue now becomes, and it's going to become, as the decades and centuries go along, a more and more pressing issue for us. Who will be in command of these human theme parks, and who will be deciding who does the domesticating and taming of the human being, and how will this process be done? Will it be something that will involve anthropotechnologies, as Sloterdijk uses the term, that involve the optimization of breeding techniques, taking birth defects and transforming them and manipulating them genetically so that they become something that can be shepherded and controlled? That's a new horizon that genetic engineering is opening up. And these are, of course, the comments that got him into so much trouble just for even daring to suggest that this might be a possibility somewhere along the horizon, to speak in this manner. A German in 1999, post-World War II, should not be speaking in this manner at all. It's not politically correct to do so. But of course, philosophy has nothing to do with political correctness. It has to do with ideas, and especially dangerous ones. And the dangerous ones are the effective ones. They're the ones that are worth thinking about, the limits of civilization here. And so what Heidegger, or rather what Sloterdijk then concludes the essay by wanting to know is that, so in the age in which we're living now, in which we have a zoo, and we have people that we're not sure who are in charge, who needs to be in charge, and why, and what the issue is for the domestication process, because now, with the breakdown of humanism, we don't have this idea anymore that the human being becomes civilized by reading texts, by sitting in a room, studying the great discourse of Western civilization, and then becoming humanized and having an inhibition ring basically built around his violent impulses. We don't have that anymore. Mass culture and the culture industry has arisen and has made that marginalized, has marginalized the humanistic tradition. So in the case that it has been marginalized, and humanism in that sense has broken down, and Heidegger has put into, speaking of man as the shepherd of being, has tried to put something in its place, but that Sloterdijk doesn't feel is an effective community-building idea. This idea of these lone monk-like individuals listening to being is not a good substitute for the humanist tradition. Rushing into the void, of course, we have the decline of the book and the rise of the stadium, and we have all of these disinhibiting media now, with all these violent films that encourage violence, and of course kids go and they see these things and they think that pulling guns is the way to solve problems, and we get the disintegration in the classroom. We get more and more shootings. People are more and more apt to solve their problems through violence in a culture in which the humanistic tradition has broken down. Texts and books no longer have the civilizing, taming, domesticating effect that they're meant to have, and we have the human individual regressing back to the state of a barbaric individual. And so Sloterdijk concludes the essay by saying then that these letters that were sent by these great humanists are now being archived, and the archivist now has replaced the humanist. The archivist simply catalogs the books on the shelves, but the archivist, unlike the humanist, is no longer really doing much to go back, pull the books off the shelves, and look for the ideas that have been the civilizing effects on the human being throughout the course of the evolution of civilization. That's happening less and less often, and as the result of that, the archivist has taken over, and we get this monk-like idea of this individual with the books on the shelves behind him that are gathering dust, and nobody's pulling them down off the shelves anymore. Instead, we have the rise of the new media invasion, as I wrote about in my book, The New Media Invasion, or Adorno's culture industry, in which all of this media is rising to the surface exactly as it did in the days of the Romans with their gladiatorial arenas and their amphitheaters and their hippodromes. Now we have them electronically plugged in. When you take a hippodrome and you plug electricity, send electricity racing through it, you get a videodrome, but it basically has the same disinhibiting effect on the population. And so the issue becomes, who's in charge of this circus? Who do we want in charge of this circus? Sloterdijk is simply raising these issues. He doesn't have the answers to them. He's not suggesting that a cultural elite needs to be in charge who is in charge of things like eugenics or racial hygiene or anything like that. He's simply saying, with the decline of humanism, you've got a dangerous new horizon that begins to open up, in which there's a power vacuum, and individuals are going to fill this vacuum. You can count on it. And so he sees some ominous things on the horizon coming up.